So good morning and welcome to the MSSRF seminar series. Today we have Mr. Aditya Ramji, and he's the director, India ZEV Research Center at the University of California, Davis. And his talk is going to be on conceptualizing just climate transitions for a net zero India. Just to give you a small brief intro to the speaker, Mr. Ramji is an economist focusing on climate, energy, and transportation policy. And at UC Davis, he is currently director of the India ZEV Research Center and leads work on low carbon transportation and sustainable mobility. He is part of the Energy Transitions Working Group as part of India's G20 presidency, and is also associated with the Center for Technology and Policy at IIT Madras. He has and continues to serve both the center and the state governments in India, as well as private sector institutions on advisory roles, including as India's transport expert on the UNFCCC climate negotiations at COP22. So welcome, Mr. Ramji, and kindly deliver your lecture.
Thank you so much for having me here. I must say, when I knew that TJ sir is going to be here, I was already under pressure. We have had a long association working on energy access and other things back in the day. And then I found also that since you had put out the flyer that said doctor, which I still have a little bit way to go, that added a little further pressure, but hopefully I will do justice to this. I'm not an agricultural expert, so I will not attempt to even teach or preach anything about that. But what I wanted to do today was really, I worked a lot in the energy space in climate policy, and I wanted to just try and use my experiences from there in how we've dealt with some transition issues. And hopefully, some of those principles can apply to a lot of the work that all of you are doing. And then towards the end, I'd also love to, maybe hear a little bit about how a lot of you think about how the concept of climate transitions applies to some of the work that all of you are doing. And so hopefully we can keep this a little interactive. But at the outset, it's a pleasure to be back here. I actually did my master's thesis at the foundation about 13, 14 years ago. And my master's thesis was on evaluating the BioVillage program that the foundation was running, and I think it still runs. And it was about looking at the very first BioVillage program that was set up in 1991, and then evaluating the more recent ones and just understanding how intervention design needs to be thought out carefully. Because very often, I think my biggest learning back then was very often we think that the outcome that we want to achieve is the best way for a community. But often there are some other needs that need to be fulfilled before we actually can reach some of those outcomes. So my thesis was really on path dependency of interventions. A lot of it, I must say, have carried in a lot of the work that I've done eventually. Transition in itself, right, is not a new concept. We've dealt with this in different industries, economic sectors, in India, globally. But what makes the climate transition more complex is the fact that, we need to deal with the risks that climate change imposes locally, in addition to the challenges of economic growth and development, and all within a certain time frame, right? And that's what makes it a lot more complex and challenging. And for a large country like India, this challenge compounds itself, and all the more reason that we need to plan and act. But what is the transition that we actually desire, right? So let me try and give you a few examples. Back in 2010-11, when we were doing work on energy access, a lot of households back then did not have access to electricity or clean cooking. And as you know, today we say India has achieved high rates of household electrification, almost 100%. But the issue still remains that many households still do not have electricity. And the challenge is definitions. Definition says that as long as a household has the connection, you're considered electrified. But what good is that when you can't really use it and you can't really benefit from it? So a transition, one of the fundamental basis is first, how do we even think about defining the outcome that we want to achieve? During that time, I was in Madhya Pradesh, in one of the districts when we were doing field work, and one of the households actually said that we have been connected to the grid. We receive electricity depending on when the, when the grid decides it is made available to rural areas, which means often they used to get it at 9 a.m. to 12 noon. She said that we're all out on the field. That's not the time that I need the electricity. I would rather benefit from, even if it is 3 hours, I would benefit from the service, let's say from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. But what that meant was they were still being charged a flat rate every month for the electricity that they were being supplied. So now she was paying 60 rupees every month for electricity that she couldn't use. Now, and then in addition to that, she was still purchasing kerosene and whatever else to kind of meet her lighting requirements and energy needs, right? And that experience kind of taught me, and this is all I'm talking about times before we even started talking in recent years about just transitions and climate transitions in a big way, right? And that experience kind of and effort taught us really about intervention design and the cost of transitions that are involved. Another example was Maharashtra. Between 2012 and 2014, a lot of households in Maharashtra reported a great push in electricity access. And a lot of that was being done by what was then called decentralized renewable energy or off-grid household electricity systems that were being supplied. Small solar panels on the rooftop with a small battery, helping households, meet certain minimum hours of electricity needs since they're not connected to the grid. Very good, but few years later, we found a reverse transition. We were monitoring these households almost every 2 years. And we found a reverse transition. Why? Because these systems started to fail. What that taught us was that transitions need to be reliable. Solutions need to have a factor of reliability attached to it. But all is not bad, right? India had a massive solar pumps program that we've been deploying over the last few years. It works well in areas with high water tables, but does not work well in areas where there are lower water tables. In fact, Punjab is a good example. We've had a massive reduction in water tables in that state now over the last few years. Solar pumps were not the ideal thing to be deployed there, right? What that taught us was appropriateness of technology. But one thing that I still remember was in Karnataka, when they were deploying solar pumps, very often farmers, when they used to have, when they started transitioning from diesel pump sets to electric pump sets, because of the unreliability in electricity, they used to leave the electric pump sets on, right? So whenever the electricity would come, the pump would come on and it would flood the fields. Now, whether you needed X amount of water or not didn't matter because no one would go back at 2 a.m. to decide whether the pump needs to be on or off, right? But when we put solar pumps, the mindset was the same, right? So they would put on the pump, it would come on, the switch is always on, the whole day it would be running. But certain cropping systems or areas did not require that amount of water. So, and a small innovation, a 200 rupee sensor that could be shut on or switched off, a pump with an SMS, was developed by a small firm in Bangalore. And they deployed it on the solar pumps that were being put in the state of Karnataka. What that meant was it allowed now a farmer to actually shut and conserve water. And then what they also started doing was when the solar pumps were being deployed, they started charging. Many of them could not own these pumps, right? So they would lease it or use it on a service basis. They started charging the value of energy as a shadow price of the value of water, right? And that led to conservation of water in certain areas where this program was deployed. Another example is clean cooking transitions, LPG. We started pushing LPG cylinders to households in rural areas. A lot of households got the first LPG cylinder, but could never continue using that as a clean cooking fuel because the cost of refilling the cylinder was very expensive. An innovation that happened was creating the 5 kg cylinder that started being given to households because that could be a smaller, easier, and a more affordable way for households to transition. Some of these solutions started, these are examples of where we learned that just technology or just a cost is not the way. How do you create a floor to the how do you ensure that there is no slip from the trajectory that you're actually trying to get to? The other one that I can recall is we did this initiative for solar for healthcare many years ago in Chhattisgarh. That was a project where we were. I must say we as energy economists we thought, or off-grid systems are the best way to go. We want to find just ways to fit this into households. Maybe not the right approach, right? But at some point we realized that a lot of the narrative was only about households. We realized that there were schools and primary health centers in villages that were not being connected to the grid as part of the electrification program. But those were essential to deliver certain basic services to the community to actually sustain. And so we then embarked on this project where we said, all right, the appropriateness of designing an off-grid solar system to cater to some minimum electricity requirements for a primary health center, to run basic cold storage, to run, even provide a basic light and fan for the delivery room, etc., was how we went about it. And that project was actually a good success. About 27 districts in Chhattisgarh ultimately decided to implement that design, etc. But what that did was it created a resilience to the system, right, to the health system. And that's what a transition is about, right? All of these factors of geographical context, of cost, of reliability, of resilience, and creating a floor to keep ensuring that you move ahead and not really slip back. And kind of what I would then call as a sustainable transition. If you go back a decade or more, we used to talk about environmental impact assessments 20 years ago, right? Before we got into this whole climate narrative. The notion was the same. The idea was to evaluate any project based on, its impacts on local systems, on land, on people, on resources, and then being able to propose mitigating or adaptation solutions that can help, communities or the ecosystem to adapt to the changes that were being proposed. We spent many years building a lot of things on the concept of EIA. Now we're facing the problem where we're having to undo a lot of things. And we're calling that just transitions, right? Take the example of coal transitions. This is now the most the biggest buzz in the energy space, and then this is where the concept of just transitions is, at least now in India and many other countries, being looked at. Imagine shutting down a coal power plant. In most of India, if you look at, there are about 135 districts, if I'm not mistaken, that have assets of coal power plants today. Most of these districts, a lot of the economy has revolved around the existence of that coal power plant. When you remove that, you also remove the source of livelihoods, of sustenance, of many things for a lot of the ecosystem that has evolved around it over 30, 40 years. How do you rehabilitate these people? How do you relook at where these people will go? Just repurposing that coal power plant with, let's say, a solar power plant doesn't do the job, right? It will mean a shift in labor requirement. It will mean a shift in skill sets requirement. It may mean that not everybody can even live in that area and may have to move to other places. How do you look at a lot of these things? These are all elements of the cost of transition, and have a framing of a just and equitable transition. Coal itself employs about 13 million people across mining, transport, power, iron and steel, and all of the sectors that depend on the coal ecosystem. And a lot more people are employed informally, very similar to the agriculture sector, etc. And in coal, we've estimated that this number is almost 20 million. That's the population. That's actually more than the population of about 160 countries today in the world. And just to kind of give you a sense of the impact that such transitions have. So even moving to clean energy or climate resilient transitions has effects that we need to account for. And this is further complicated by labor force dynamics, right? We have contract labor, we have informal labor, skills, socioeconomic profiles. How do we account for a lot of this in the planning is something that we don't do effectively today. We talk about net zero targets. India has set and announced a net zero for 2070. All that means is that from a base year, we will be at zero CO2 emissions in a certain by a certain year. But policies, efforts, and trajectories are not aligned to those outcomes. In fact, I should say, and maybe some of you can correct me, I have not come across in the last few months since India has announced this, actually understanding what this net zero means for different sectors, right? A good analysis. Right now, we're talking very broad understanding of what climate transitions means, etc. If we really want to be effectively be able to manage these transitions, we need to start taking a sectoral approach, something that India has not yet done often for the outside. We don't commit in our global climate commitments sectoral targets, but from a domestic action perspective, it's very important for us to understand what this means, to be able to then contextualize any of the actions and the projects we do that needs to be aligned in that perspective. And this probably is where we require a strong subnational approach to addressing these transition issues. A national approach will not do the job. I've learned this as even in the recent years as I've been working in the transport sector. A lot of the jurisdiction of transportation regulation lies with the states, very similar to many other sectors that a lot of you engage in. It is going to be states and subnational actors within states that will have the most role to play in driving and delivering and managing these transitions. Then it becomes our role in many ways as researchers to help build capacity for a lot of these institutions. For a lot of years, we focused on national level capacity building. We need to take that a level lower, right? Jharkhand is a good example. They've recently set up a Just Transitions Committee. The state is essentially a mining and coal dominated state, and a lot of its economy kind of depends on that. And so they're keen on understanding that as some of these transitions happen, what does that mean for the local economy? What does it mean for the local people? How does the state decide the next future course of policies and actions in alignment with some of these changes? But then also trying to say that having the role as a government to be able to create that ecosystem also then ensures and provides a certainty for a lot of other actors to come in. So we talk about, how do we finance some of these transitions? There's access to climate finance, a lot of institutions that are willing to put money, but because there is a lack of a clear policy framework or an action-oriented outcome framework, many of them are not able to see value in putting some of this money, right? And so the role that state governments can play in driving this is critical. And Jharkhand, through the Just Transition Committee, so next 2 years, they've set as a timeline to be able to actually look at the entire ecosystem, looking at all sectors in the state, and being able to understand how all of this aligns from a net zero or a climate outcome perspective, and then being able to outline clear policy actions over the next 8 years on what those need to mean. The same just energy transitions concept, to take a step back from a global perspective, there has been a lot of discussion, but that actually began with South Africa, which is also a coal-dominated, which has a big presence in the coal ecosystem, and a country that was recovering from issues of race and colonialism and various other issues. And for them, a just and equitable transition framework was the way to raise international climate finance, largely because they couldn't gather enough domestic finance to actually deliver some of these or push some of these changes, right? And as part of the Just Energy Transitions plan, they kind of agreed to start curbing some of these fossil fuel use, etc., and then got support for about $8.5 billion from the UK, US, Germany, and other countries. But the learnings from very similarly, actually, Indonesia has also now signed a Just Energy Transitions plan, has got some money for it. Now, Vietnam is trying to do the same thing. There's a lot of push in Senegal. For them, it is not coal, but it is oil and gas. So different countries, depending on their priorities, are figuring out what just energy transitions or just transitions rather should mean for them. There's been a lot of push on India to announce or to become part of this ecosystem. Whether India should be a part of it or not, we'll get to in a second. But the framework that the Just Transitions ecosystem applies is actually applicable to probably most sectors that we can work in some ways. And I can see some heads nodding, and that's the hope that we'll get into this discussion. But at least I would look at it as 5 things. One, to understand who will be impacted in any sector. When we move, who will be impacted? Being able to define those workers, those regions, those communities, assessing some of those multiplier effects on not just that ecosystem, but the front and forward and backward linkages and the value chain that is associated with it is important to understand. Next is to say what will be impacted. Then we get into the question of how do you actually finance this transition, what that cost involves, etc. The fourth thing would be how do you govern that transition? And that's where the role of institutions is very important. And then the last thing is to build consensus. Consensus, because our perspective of just transitions may not be what is the perspective of communities. We need to find a a workable definition of just transitions. And this will be different. Even within India, it will be different in every state. Within a state, it will probably be different at every district. And that's where the challenge of this comes in. We need institutions to operate at multiple levels to be able to actually deliver a narrative that is consistent with a lot of this. Coming to India's role, in my mind, just to also give you a flavor of where all of this fits in the larger international climate narrative. The Paris Climate Agreement agreed on $100 billion of climate investment that was supposed to come in, which we haven't still seen. A lot of it actually coming in from the developed countries to the emerging economies. The just energy transitions ecosystem is not under the UNFCCC, and it's now being looked at as another platform for financing. I'm not sure if that is what the Just Energy Transitions platform does also require is to have a sectoral approach, which India doesn't necessarily adhere to from an international perspective. But for India, it's probably time, as I said, to approach to look at, the question that we need to ask, even when we were looking at coal, for example, was, can we eliminate coal? Maybe, maybe not. Do we want to eliminate coal? Maybe not. Do we need money? No. Do we get finance on our own? We do. So then the issue is, what does then just transitions mean for us? Similarly, the same kind of issues we need to pick up in every sector and be able to actually look at what that means. This year will be critical from a climate perspective. We're going to do the global climate stocktake, but I think we're kind of pretty set on the fact that ambitions are falling well short of the 1.5 degree pathway or even the 2 degree pathway that we wanted to meet, which then means that we need to start focusing. There has been a disproportionate focus on funding and climate finance going to mitigation strategies. We don't spend enough on adaptation strategies. I was looking at the last 10 years of climate finance flows, and less than 20% has gone to any form of adaptation. And within that, even less than 10% has gone to any form of land use, agriculture, or any other ecosystem that actually requires more of an adaptation focus than just a mitigation focus. What we've done with things like solar pumps, etc., has largely been a mitigation approach strategy. Even in agriculture, if you look at the value chain, this morning we were talking about coastal areas being affected. Roads will be affected. How do you look at resilience for transport systems? They will be important to deliver commodities from point A to point B, right? We're still not there in the narrative yet. And that kind of a systems approach is what we need to take to actually be able to think about how we want to address climate transitions built on the pillars of justice and equity that we want to look at. Let me maybe leave you with a few thoughts that I think can be the next step of pieces of work that can be looked at. One, there has been for the longest time there has been a large amount of focus on energy transitions. This was the same problem we dealt with in transportation. When we talked about transportation transitions in the last couple of years, we've said that it cannot be clubbed under energy transitions. It needs to be understood for transportation for the sake of transportation. How do people move? How do goods move? And then be able to design the right kind of solutions. Similarly, in agriculture, you need to understand how that ecosystem moves, how that ecosystem functions. What is the value chain? How do things go from procurement to on-farm to off-farm activities to actually to the market? And then being able to take a systems approach to actually say, okay, where are the different pain points? Where are from let's say an emissions perspective, where are the opportunities today that technologies allow us to actually intervene and kind of and kind of find solutions to some of those problems, and where do we need to actually find viable solutions? And that's kind of what I would think. The other thing is supporting state governments, as I said, right? I know MSRF has programs already running in 3 or 4 states in Tamil Nadu, Orissa, Assam. Assam, very recently, actually, we were doing a study in Assam on clean road transport transitions, and we actually found that the state achieved about 85% of electric 3-wheelers last year. Now, the question was, how do you ensure that this keeps going forward and not slip back, right? And a lot of this transition happened because there was an additional subsidy that the government is providing, which now expired this year. And now with this money not being available, have we reached a level of technology maturity that it will allow for a scaled, adoption even without government support or other subsidy support, but more, and what we need to see a shift is actually looking at how governments can take a regulatory stand in ensuring that we create a floor to transitions. And that's where we discovered that working with state governments was where the maximum value add was being delivered in being able to build that institutional capacity and for policymaking and design. Electric tractors used to be one of my pet projects once upon a time, but I have grown to now think that maybe that's not the best way to look at at certain solutions. Haryana actually is a state that's providing a subsidy for electric tractors, but we haven't seen too many people come up with solutions on this. The reason being that the notion was we can change a vehicle that would address emissions. But what that was not built on was an understanding of how tractors operate, what are the use cases that they function in, and how these are actually relied on in different ecosystems in the farm. Some of them are only used on farm for captive, some of them actually track trailers, and maybe electrification is not a solution therefore, right? So, but that's a classic example of how a one-line thinking of states does not necessarily fix a problem. Take biofuels, for instance. We've talked about it for many years. India is now pushing hard again on the biofuel narrative. Now that has implications on feedstock. That has implications on agriculture value chains. Can we look at, understanding what that means? Is it actually feasible? Few years ago, we talked about complete electrification of road transports. That meant that we were looking at electricity as a solution. We didn't, now we're talking more liquid carbon fuels, which means that over the next 10, 12 years, that push is going to increase. We need more ethanol. We need more of, we're already reaching 20% blending in 2 years. We're now talking about going up to 60% in certain vehicles. But no one has actually sat down and actually made the effort to understand what the value chain effects are, and whether that's a feasible strategy for India from a cost perspective, from a transition perspective, and just emissions alone cannot be necessarily the driving force for a lot of this transition strategy. Last thing I would say is we need data. One of the biggest challenges we've had in being able to understand how to manage transitions and how to actually create those strategies, how to even develop projects that can be, for the lack of a better word, be bankable, whether it's public money or private money, is the lack of data. Most sectors, we've struggled over time to get reliable information at a disaggregated level to actually be able to understand, track certain key parameters, and which will form the foundation of a lot of these strategies. So even working with the right entities at the state or subnational level to create some of these basic data sources and find innovative ways to gather a lot of these can itself be a significant foundational value add to how we look at transition strategies. I'll just give you one last example. In Rajasthan, we were trying to look at, when the government said we've electrified 100% households, we started to talk about reliability of electricity supply, etc. We actually created a simple SMS-based data collection system where we basically asked a set of households in different villages across Rajasthan, covered about 40 or 45 villages, and a sample of households where all they had to tell us was, did you get electricity today or not? Just a simple yes and no, and a simple number-based this thing of we got for 3 hours or 2 hours or whatever. And we created 2 or 3 different parameters. And over the last 3 years, we were actually able to collect information that otherwise is not available. But these are small innovations. Today, I mean, a lot of people have cell phones. We can use some of these technology opportunities to actually be able to monitor and track some of these, which helps us then create the right kind of solutions for a lot of these communities, right? So the last thing I would say is, from what we need to do now is sectoral plans, state government action, and research institutions like yours. A lot of the work that you're doing at district levels, at the state level, is what is now gaining a lot of traction, because now we have realized that that's where we need to go down to understand the real needs of how we design any of these policies towards climate transitions. And the replicability. We've learned now what we're doing a lot here applies to a lot of the emerging economies in the global south. The replicability of the solutions, of the strategies, or even the learnings of what to do, what not to do, are of immense value to countries in the global south. We've created something called a rapid response force under the COP framework to actually help some of these emerging economies learn from each other. Right now, it's focused on power sector and transportation, but including other sectors is the aim, and the ability to be actually expand that, where countries, when they're designing some of these, to be able to skip learning phases and learn from each other is the kind of platforms that are needed. But institutions that do a lot of this work are the ones who can actually deliver a lot of this information. And so therefore, I think that is the one thing where I feel like Indian institutions can actually be a very good laboratory for the world or for the emerging south in the way we deal with climate transitions and how we actually set that narrative. The last thing I will say is, I would love at some point maybe to see actually an institution like MSSRF with partners actually be able to set out even a framework or a narrative on what a just transition should mean from, let's say, agriculture or from food systems. Even to set the narrative is important. It took us a long time to do that in other sectors. We need to begin in agriculture. We've always been hesitant from a policy perspective to touch that space, but maybe it cannot come from the government because it's seen in a different perspective. It has to come from institutions that have that rapport with communities to be able to actually work with them, build on that knowledge, and create something like that. And I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramji. Actually, we'll take some questions from both online as well as you'll stay here?
Yeah.
Answer this. Okay. So I'll probably open it first here and we'll wait for some questions to appear online. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question also?
Thank you, Ramji, for this wonderful lecture and also highlighting the various aspects, as well as one thing I'm able to catch up is the bottom-up approach, which is very basic, very much we practice in the foundation, is going to give us the solutions and not the top-down. That is one. Another one is the feedback mechanism. Whatever interventions we are going to speak about, unless and otherwise we get back the data and see how exactly the situations are emerging. That is another very important dimension every researcher need to bring into their perspective. We were well said about biofuels. Not necessarily we need to now look for food crops to go for biofuels. We have very good oil yielding trees, leave alone Jatropha. There are wonderful trees and very many native trees are available here. Tree-borne oil, it may, the investments have to be made, and after some time, we may get the very good yield and start processing, so that there are several alternative mechanisms and so on. Thank you very much for highlighting all these things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya. That was a very comprehensive talk and very thought-provoking as well. So I just wanted to also bring in the health angles of the climate change. You mentioned adaptation, and clearly many of the events which are expected to happen because of the 2-degree rise or even higher is going to be impact on human health. And so a lot of the adaptation, well, mitigation has to continue, but adaptation mechanism needs to think about the impacts on health. And it's interesting you mentioned agriculture and food systems, because food systems, are so important for nutrition. And I think we have to think about the transition pathway or solutions which will be good for health, good for the environment, and good for climate, obviously. So I think these are the kind of things that probably we need to develop. And I think your idea of having some dialogue and discussion on what would be that kind of a transition pathway for agriculture and food systems is very important. I think we can definitely see whom we can work with to take that forward. Thank you. You can see some questions online.
There's a question online. We could take that and then come back here. So what is the hurdle for climate finance to focus more on adaptation and less on mitigation?
I think the issue has always been that, true, exactly. And with mitigation, the outcomes are very clear for a lot of people to say. I mean, the unfortunate part is originally when we got into this whole climate finance discussion in the negotiations, and TJ, you've been involved in this for a long time, but it was always about public money. But unfortunately, that public money has never flown through. And it has now been a lot of private money that has actually been coming in. But private sector always invests because they can see certain returns. And there is no denying that. And that's been easy to do with mitigation projects. That's unfortunately never been easy to do with adaptation projects. I'll give you an example. Take roads. We talked about it just briefly, but there are going to be areas that are just going to deal with roads being destroyed every 10 years. However resilient we may create it, at some point we may have to deal with recurring costs. Now, which business or private sector will want to put money in something like this? They wouldn't, right? But this kind of money needs to come in, and that's why, in my mind, the role of public finance in driving or the contribution of public finance within the climate finance space will be very critical in driving some of the adaptation strategies. Mitigation can actually at some point be done through creating viable technologies and commercially viable ecosystems.
Yeah. Thank you, Aditya. That was, especially people are not familiar with the just transition language. That was a very useful, complete overview of some of the issues in just transition. Now, I just have a couple of remarks. And one is with regard to putting India on par with South Africa. With Vietnam, that's more, a kind of, it's a matter of convenience. India and Vietnam were very different in many respects. With Indonesia, there is better comparability, but then Indonesia is also placed for various reasons differently. So India is unique in that. And I think one persistent message that has come from India on just transition is that just transition for India is not decarbonization, and that it is low carbon development. Now, even our mutual good friend Navroz Dubash, who's had his, various views on it, in his latest article in the Hindu, a few days ago, he completely agrees with it now. Just transition is low carbon development. The second point, you made this point about whether India has any kind of a roadmap. Now, over a 50-year time scale, 50 years ago was when I was just passing out of school. Okay, the world has completely changed in terms of technology, in terms of society, opportunities, etc. So in 50 years, at this point, what do we need? Blueprints, or do we need visions, imaginations, and directions? So I think all of them have to be fleshed out in practice over shorter time scales. But if you, like some of our modeling colleagues, think that you can predict to the last dollar what will be the price of food in 2070, I think you and I will agree they are fooling themselves. So I think in this respect, it is very important to look at the long-term low emission development strategy submission that India has made to the UNFCCC, which is now a sort of definitive official statement of India's vision of the progress towards net zero and fulfilling the Paris Agreement targets. So there, I think, is where we should perhaps pitch our discussion, because it represents a level of consensus. Not everybody agrees on everything, level of consensus between government and various other stakeholders, and this is the product of a process of dialogue. And a very important part of that long-term vision is the rational use of fossil fuels. And I agree with you that, I'm happy to see that you agree that exclusive battery-driven electrification is no longer the vision we have. Hydrogen, there are other possibilities. Though I would be disturbed by some of the estimates which are floating around, which are far too, I would say, optimistic without anything really behind it. And you can't go put our entire future on what Rocky Mountain Institute thinks is the future. So that's the second point. The last point is about agriculture. Now, I was very closely involved with the Coronavia negotiations at COP 27. I don't want to go into the details. But the point is not so much that the government is reluctant to talk about transition in agriculture, but that we are being pushed into a corner with an exclusive mitigation focus in agriculture. Now, the United States and others made it very clear. They said, if you didn't want to discuss mitigation in agriculture, we are not even interested in this decision. You can go and talk about it in adaptation. So it is mitigation why we came here. And in India, with the kind of carbon prices that will be talked about, what will flow to the farmer, all those issues which are partly studied, partly not studied, and whatever we know, the impact of markets on the poor, how disequalizing it can be, calls for a lot of caution. So I think it's not so much perhaps a focus in agriculture. Eventually, yes, just transition, but just transition in agriculture should begin with doubling farmers' incomes, doubling productivity, ensuring the end of hunger, ensuring the development of rural opportunities. And the thing about carbon, etc., should follow from it. Carbon should not lead, and agriculture would be the site of adaptation still for a long time, rather than mitigation. And I think this is the thing where the government reacts if internationally it is thought to be cornered. So that's, otherwise PM Kusum is there, various other things, though I'm not a fan of zero budget natural farming. I don't think it works. But the floor is open for a number of initiatives and discussion. But we cannot be cornered into a mitigation strategy. And that's, I think, a serious, not just a moral, ethical concern for people, it's also a strategic national concern. But otherwise, thank you for a good overview and very useful account of where we are on just transition today.
No, appreciate your comments. If I can only just take a minute to respond to what you said. I agree that India is not the same as some of these other countries, but and that's the problem, right? As more of these countries agree to some of these finance deals with the West, it puts a lot of pressure on India from an international perspective. We've done well so far to hold out and say that, you know, that's not, we're not going to get into this just because everyone else does it. And I think that's absolutely point taken. On visions, imagination, directions, most of our visions, imaginations, directions have always been national. The issue for me, my biggest learning over the last 12, 13 years doing this is that we are not able to actually create some of these visions and directions based on an understanding of what is really required. And agriculture, like you said, yes, government may refrain from doing a certain set of things, but maybe that's where the role of other institutions becomes even more critical in driving some of this. May or may not agree, but we've seen, right, for example, in transportation, I will say governments have been reluctant to do a lot of this. It has come from other institutions pushing the narrative. We've seen this happen in power and some of the over time, right? And wherever there is something that is sensitive, governments tend to take a cautious approach to dealing with it, but doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with it. We still have to deal with it. It's a question of then who or which set of institutions can play that role in bridging that communication. is something that I think is probably the way to go. But approaches can differ. On carbon pricing, I will only say this. So now there is a national carbon market amendment that's come in, and the government is trying to do all of this stuff. It will obviously not cover agriculture directly, but it will cover other parts that contribute to the agricultural industry. So it will cover rail, it will cover road, it will do and if this kind of ecosystem imposes a certain set of costs of compliance on some of these value chains, it could have effects on how that ecosystem actually delivers. And I think that is important to understand. Even as a lot of you as researchers do a lot of this, it's very important to understand how some of these other aspects can impact, how the core sector operates and delivers on some of this. Sorry.
There's, I think, one more question online. It's talking about energy transition. Have the global crisis stalled the progress on climate goals? What do you think about it?
When you say global crisis, I presume you talk about the last 2-3 years of pandemic and everything else and the Russia war and whatnot. But I don't think it is necessarily stalled. The progress, many countries have taken this an opportunity to actually take a slightly stronger step in saying that we want to be able to achieve climate goals. But we've also seen Europe, who had held out consistently in the last 1 year, give up on a lot of that. Not to say that that's a wrong thing. It became a matter of sustenance for people. Energy prices, energy security started driving the basic economy, right? And started affecting everyday lives of people. And that's when the EU ecosystem had to take a call on, for example, Germany brought back its coal power plants.
The only point
from that
countries like India is that the same consideration which they are willing to show themselves
should be shown.
Extended to
Absolutely.
Us, we say we have issue.
Absolutely.
That's where we get.
Absolutely, and I agree, and I think that's the thing, right? So the crisis in itself may not have stalled the progress, but what it does show is that systems are not as resilient as we always think that we can create them to be, and we need to be prepared to be able to deal with some of this. But that imposes a lot of costs on maintaining certain assets that may not be needed today, but we need it when you are in that situation once in a lifetime. But that situation can be critical in breaking or making the system. So I think those are thought processes that we need to kind of think about when you talk about crisis and energy transition.
Okay, thank you, Aditya. If there aren't any questions, we'd like to close the seminar for today. You have a question? Okay. So you can introduce yourself, please.
Sector approach has to be defined clearly. What I think is there is a need to create new infrastructure in the area of energy, transport, and land use. Another point is creating new administrative system at the village and urban level itself. So I want to know, how do you define sectoral approach for global economy? What are the things to be done? That is my question.
So sectoral approach will have to be done for every country, not necessarily for the globe. 1, 2, like Professor Jayan was saying, it has to be based on it has to be based on first understanding what is required in that ecosystem. And like you said, it's not decarbonization, it's low carbon development, but it will mean different things. So an energy sector approach to low carbon development will have a different strategy. For India, it'll have a different strategy. For South Africa, it'll have a different strategy. For the US, an agricultural low carbon development approach will have a completely different meaning. And for a country like India, it might even have different meanings in different states, right? Or at least regions, if not states. But and being able to actually acknowledge that and be able to think about it at that level before we decide that this is the right way to go or whatever is probably the first step. But also, I think we should also be prepared that sectoral approaches have to be changed and will need to be changed on a dynamic basis. We can't have a plan for 10 years and then revisit it in 2035. It won't work like that. And I think increasingly now we're seeing that every time we create a plan, we pretty much in 18 to 24 months end up in a situation where it's disrupted due to some other climate event or whatever else. So I think being able to create, have a sectoral approach should be able to define the trajectory, the broad goals, and where, like TJ said, the visions and the direction you want to go in, but the specific strategies will have to be consistently reviewed and dynamically kind of monitored. And that brings also to my earlier point on data, etc. You need to create those systems to be able to actually say that, yes, the strategy is working, or this is where it's not working, and here we need to make changes. It's going to be a consistent approach. It will never be a one plan which we can sit with. I think that's definitely the biggest learning we've had now. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So on that note, I think we'll close the seminar for today. Thank you, Aditya. Thank you for those who have joined us online as well.